So by now you've probably seen that the Montana Supreme Court overruled and actually reversed the $35 million case that was brought against Watchtower and cited in their favor on that. And we weren't necessarily going to do a video on this subject, but we saw so many people upset about it and commenting about it. It was just kind of mind-blowing, I guess. I mean, don't get me wrong, being victims of child abuse ourselves and being victims of Watchtower abuse as adults, we feel the exact same emotion and frustration that everyone else does. And having to watch what's happening to these victims who bravely came forward to speak about what happened to them and their abuse under Watchtower policy, and then see Watchtower basically get away with it, leaving these victims exposed and naked in the cold while they just walk away with the pedophile after holding his coat pretty much and looking on while he does the deed. So we get that. But it's still kind of amazing that all these witnesses and ex-witnesses are commenting on how unfair this is when they see this case being overturned. But it's like, wait a minute. How did you become witnesses not thinking this justice system was broken? That's the whole point of Christ's kingdom, that this system is broken and there is no real justice. I mean, I knew that before becoming a witness. I mean, I spent 3 days in jail because of my car alarm going off. I mean, no lie, there was a guy that was in there for his third offense and drunk driving, and he got off on less time than I did.
And we won't even go into injustice in the courts from our child abuse.
I guess for us, what's shocking is that we just didn't expect, at least back when we became witnesses, that Watchtower was going to be the perpetrator of such injustice, right next to the broken judicial system, in bed with them, basically. So in this breakfast soapbox, I'm going to go off on some nuts and bolts issues, basically, and then we'll have a bit of a rant session at the end. So as I mentioned, there's a couple of nuts and bolts things to discuss here. One being the law of penitent privilege itself, and the other being the practice of law. And to be clear, practice of law is not about justice. It's about legality. There are plenty of things in this world that are clearly wrong or unjust, and yet not against the law. Adultery that destroys families, for example, yet it's legal. Or the illustration I used in a previous video about an uncontrolled intersection and yielding the right-of-way. You see, I come to the uncontrolled intersection, I yield to the right, they yield to their right, and so on. So the person that hits me from my left, it's their fault. And we all say, yes, that's the law. And I'm excused. Until I tell you that person that hit me from the left was a 10-year-old on his bicycle. It doesn't matter in our moral mind that he shouldn't have legally been riding his bicycle on the sidewalk, or that if he was in the street, he should have been yielding to me. The principle is not to get in a wreck, and I violated that when I just simply looked to the right and proceeded through the intersection. So practice of law is not necessarily about justice of principle. Generally speaking, practice of law is not about what's right and wrong. It's about manipulation of legality. We've all heard the saying, the spirit of the law. But how many laws on the books do we see that are now just ridiculous? They've totally lost the context that the law was written in. Principally speaking, it's why Jesus hated the religious leaders in his day, because they were just a bunch of lawyers. Think of the woman with the flow of blood. She broke the law. She shouldn't have been touching Jesus. She most certainly shouldn't have been in a crowd of people touching them. She wasn't supposed to be touching anyone while unclean with the flow of blood. She broke the law. But Jesus sent her away in mercy. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. So that's the first thing to understand about practice of law, at least in this country. It's not about right and wrong. We were talking to my sister, who happens to be a lawyer, about what the Watchtower and the elders had done to us and how we were treated. And repeatedly, we found ourselves hearing her say, that sucks, or that's just wrong, but it's not against the law. Now, she wasn't trying to be hard-hearted and cold. I mean, at the time, she was a CPS lawyer. Probably one of the most emotionally triggering areas of law there is. But she helped us separate what was obviously morally wrong from what was against the law. Because when you enter that courtroom venue, you need to have pinpointed exactly what the charge is. And you don't want to muddle the issue with legally unsubstantiated emotional issues that will apperceive a discredit to your actual point of a legal case. Again, law is not about right or wrong, it's about legality. And in this venue, there are two things that you need. One is the pinpointed charge, the tip of the spear, as it were. And the second is traction. Think of traction as the weighted shaft of the spear. The tip can be as sharp as a razor and as on point as possible, but unless there is force of weight behind it, it's not going to penetrate. It's not going to be effective. A bullet in your hand is powerless. You have to have the machine to ignite the primer and the force behind it before it becomes effective. I can't stress this enough. It has to have traction. A religion of 8 million, that's traction. It has to have weight behind it. Even in drag racing or in Tesla's truck pull versus Ford in a tug-of-war, there has to be weight there. You've got to be able to put the power to the pavement. This is the thing that Watchtower understands and most XJWs don't. I hear Jonas talking about it quite a bit in his efforts with All Religions Must and respecting human rights of a child. No doubt he's got several issues that he could take up with Watchtower. But this is a pinpointed solution to a problem. And really, a protest doesn't do anything except for build traction. It gets visibility from non-witnesses, which gets people as weight behind it in unity, behind that tip of the spear, giving that tip weight, so that way it can be effective. Again, same with practice of law. It's not about justice or what's right or wrong. It's about legality. If you want to enact justice, that's what legislation is for. And that's kind of the way Jonas is going there. Jehovah's Witnesses are renowned for not getting involved in voting, as that legalistically gives them the impression that they're separate from the world. But the reality is that Watchtower knows that, at least in this country, the voting pool is not the most powerful avenue of change. In reality, voting is just a way of satisfying the masses, so that way it makes them think that they have a say. I mean, think about it. Even in the biggest office, the presidency, is it the popular vote that determines the president? Isn't it the Electoral College? Furthermore, what is gerrymandering? You see, Watchtower knows that unless all witnesses lived inside of one state, it really wouldn't change the outcome at all. And there's something way more powerful than popular votes. Think about it. Does a company bother with going door to door and trying to secure your vote for a certain policy? No. They know policy gets set by legislators, not necessarily votes. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the case in Montana a little. So they get behind the tip of the spear on the point that's important to them. That's what these businesses do. And then they send lobbyists. And Watchtower has lobbyists. Representatives for Watchtower who go out as their full-time job, volunteering or not, to meet with those in power and schmooze them over. And Watchtower admits as much in their articles where they flat out say that it's okay to bribe officials. They know it's way more productive than any voting pool. And having 8 million members as weight behind the spear is what Watchtower understands that the XJW community as a whole does not.
Yeah, unity.
Yeah.
They want to claim they have unity. And in some ways they do have unity.
Yep. The second thing to discuss, the law of penitent privilege itself. It's good to remember that penitent privilege is not a biblical principle. It's a secular law. At least that's why I've never heard Watchtower defending it with scripture. It's a legal issue. From what I'm aware, Watchtower's never used any scripture in dealing with this issue. But in the archaic spirit of the law of penitent privilege, it was created no doubt under a twofold evolution. One, religious persecution is a cornerstone of the foundation of this country, and that gives religion sort of its own autonomy. And second, that penitent privilege served the state as a secular means to an end, to help control the population in conforming to societal norms. The law has to catch you breaking the law if they haven't taught you how not to break the law. And if they can't catch you breaking the law, well, then they can't reform you. Religion served as sort of a safety net in that regard. If a church or religion is able to help reform a criminal to live by societal norms, then penitent privilege is just one more way to achieve that goal of the secular state, which is, of course, good for everyone in society. However, as we just discussed, with any law, the principle or spirit of the law gets lost in the legality, and it's no different with penitent privilege. But as society has progressed and technology has progressed in its means for catching and reforming criminals, penitent privilege exponentially loses its spirit of the law or motivation of the law. So that now, increasingly, any battle is not about the spirit of the law or the principles that it was founded on, but rather the legalities in the law itself. Even its long-established existence outside of any principal usefulness. Again, practice of law is not about justice. It's about legality. So now let's look at the law of penitent privilege itself. Now, we've seen a lot of comments talking about, oh, what's Zolkin going to do now? Or what's going to be the outcome in these other cases of child abuse? But we have to remember, each state has its own law in this regard. Zolkin is principally working in New York right now, not Montana. New York's the ones that have waived the statute of limitations on child sex abuse for a year, and other states are likely going to follow suit. And other states have different laws regarding penitent privilege from Montana. So if you just do a simple Google search on, quote, how many states have mandatory reporting for clergy, end quote, we see a box at the top, and we'll put a link in the description for that box that comes up. But if we go look at that, and we'll pull it up right here, we see that 28 states have a form of penitent privilege. And if we scroll down to Montana, we'll do that right now. Scroll down to Montana. It's got a whole list of different things, and then it gets into the states themselves. I'm just going to go straight to Montana. And you'll see that some are pretty straightforward and others are not. So for instance, I'm going to skip right over Montana for a second and go to the next one, which is Nebraska. One short paragraph. It gives the citation from the code. But it says, when any person has reasonable cause to believe that a child has been subjected to child abuse or neglect, or observes that child being subjected to conditions or circumstances that reasonably would result in child abuse or neglect, he or she shall report such incident or cause. A report of child abuse or neglect to be made to the proper law enforcement agency or to the Department of Social Services. That's it. From what I understand, there's zero circumstances there. You report it. That's all there is to it. Underneath that, Nevada is even shorter. Again, it quotes the citation number and whatever else, but it says a report must be made by a clergy member, practitioner of Christian Science, or religious healer unless he or she has acquired the knowledge of this abuse or neglect from the offender during a confession. So that is specific. So we see the difference there. Nevada didn't pull out clergy separately. They just said everybody reports. No, or Nebraska didn't pull out clergy separately. They just said anybody who has reason to believe that child abuse is occurring has to report it. You go down to Nevada, it gives an exception that a clergy member has to report it unless it's the perpetrator who comes with a confession to them. That would be penitent privilege. However, if the victim came forward, that wouldn't fall into that statute. And we'll get into this when we get into Montana, because Montana's a little bit wordy as far as theirs goes. And we'll talk about this in a minute. But again, it gives the citation number and the code. The term clergy means any of the following. And then it gives some bullet points. An ordained minister, priest, or rabbi. Next bullet point. A commissioned or licensed minister of a church or church denomination that ordains ministers if the person has the authority to perform substantially all the religious duties of the church or denomination. Next bullet point. A member of a religious order who has taken a vow of poverty. And the last bullet point, a Christian Science practitioner. So those are the bullet points that are in there. Now, how do those bullet points get set? How is it that Christian Science has its own bullet point there? How do these get set? We talked about lobbyists earlier. Do you think that this individual happens to know specifically everything about Christian Science or every religion? No, there are lobbyists that go to these legislators. Oh, and as far as clergy is concerned, Watchtower said, oh no, for years, we don't have a clergy. We don't have a clergy lady class. We don't have a clergy lady class. But Mark O'Donnell brought out once on one of his discussions that there's a case, and the transcript's available. I'm sure he has it. I don't have it off the top of my head. But Watchtower said, we don't have a clergy class. And I think it was the judge who basically said, you want to think about that again? Oh, no, we don't have a clergy class. And it's like, are you sure you don't have a clergy class? Oh, yes, we don't have that. And then it was like he was trying to get them to get to the point, well, then you don't have an argument for penitent privilege if there's not a clergy. So then finally they went and conferred, the lawyers did, and then they came back and said, oh, yeah, yep, we have a clergy class. So they just totally backtracked off it for legality. So now we go to that section, second section, because that was the first part of the code that dealt with definition of clergy. Now, the second one dealing with penitent privilege. It gives the citation code and then says, professionals and officials required to report include members of the clergy. This is under Montana law. Second sentence, a member of the clergy or priest is not required to report under this section if any of the following apply. We have 3 bullet points. The knowledge or suspicion of the abuse or neglect came from a statement or confession made to the member of the clergy or priest in that person's capacity as a member of the clergy or priest. So in other words, you think about the Catholic priest who's in the confessional. Now, if you're out having lunch with him and you reveal this, that may not be, or at least could come under the scrutiny of legality there. And it would be more of a gray area, whether or not the individual thought that he was confessing to his priest or not. And with priests, it's pretty easy because they actually have a confessional booth. But a lot of religions don't have that type of a situation. But here we see it's from the perpetrator himself as a confession. That gives him penitent privilege, or the priest penitent privilege in that regard. Second bullet point. The statement was intended to be part of a confidential communication between the member of the clergy or the priest and a member of the church or congregation. So that would be the perpetrator. So between the priest or the pastor or the elder and the individual, it would have to be confidential between those two. So if it was meant to be confidential between those two, the discussion, well, then that would fall underneath that exception. And we'll get into that in a moment when it comes to Watchtower. The third and final bullet point. The person who made the statement or confession does not consent to the disclosure by the member of the clergy or priest. In other words, the priest would ask, well, can I go talk to the law about this to turn you in? No. Okay, well, I guess I'll be quiet then. I mean, who would agree to that? The last statement that's made under there is a member of the clergy or a priest, and this isn't a bullet point, but it's just a last sentence. It says, a member of the clergy or priest is not required to make a report under this section if the communication is required to be confidential by canon law, by church doctrine, or established church practice. It's required to be confidential by canon law, by doctrine, or established church practice. So again, we have this idea of professionals and officials are required to report, including members of the clergy, as the first sentence. So how is it we get that? And then we get all these bullet points that exclude or these exceptions. How do we come to that point? That there are stipulations in mandatory reporting for clergy, which honestly all but invalidate mandatory reporting for clergy. So why have the law in the first place? No doubt what we see here is politicking at its best. A law for mandatory reporting to satisfy the populace, and exceptions that all but nearly invalidate the law to satisfy the lobbyists. Again, what's more powerful? Votes of the populace or lobbyists of entities? The general public voter rarely goes and reads the actual penal codes, but lobbyists and lawyers always are reading them. And the workarounds always achieve the lobbyists' and their lawyers' goals for the powerful entities they represent. As for this case in Montana, obviously it can be appealed yet again. And in that way, perhaps even greater good will actually be achieved if it's accepted by the higher court. Now, we're not claiming to be lawyers here, but here's what we see as the angle that would need to be clarified. And perhaps it's what Mark O'Donnell was talking about when I saw that he briefly commented on this Montana Supreme Court deal and that the court really wasn't aware of all the facts. We don't know. But here's what we see. This isn't the situation of a perpetrator coming to the elder, the priest, in a one-on-one situation of confidentiality and confessing. It's the victim coming forward. The victim. Oftentimes with their parents. Then, if it goes to a judicial committee meeting, it's before at least 3 men, along with whoever the elders are conferring with at Bethel, not to mention the rumor mill that leaks through the sieve of the elders and their wives anyway. And then, if there's an appeal committee meeting, 3 more elders, and again, the Bethel representatives that they'll confer with, are all going to be aware of this. It could literally be 10 to 12 people, and then you count witnesses that may be brought in or may not be brought in, their parents that know, and whatever else. You could have 15 to 20 people that are aware of this situation. How is that confidentiality in regard to the spirit of the law and the way it was set up in the first place? It's not. But again, we're not talking about what's right or wrong. We're talking about legality. It's hardly the spirit behind the law of penitent privilege. Penitent privilege was created so a person, the perpetrator, would come forward and confess his sin to God through his priest as a mediator to God, which Watchtower says they don't have in the first place, that they don't have a mediator. But back to the perpetrator, he wouldn't have done that otherwise. The law was created so that he'd come forward and have some sort of a safety net reform for the state. The law was not created to rebuff victims and silence them. So if we go back to that code again and just kind of glance over it, how did these come about? It was because of lobbyists. It's kind of funny, in that last statement, a member of the clergy or priest is not required to make a report under this section if the communication is required to be confidential by canon law, church doctrine, or established church practice. Does this sound like what a legislator would come up with? Not at all. It's what lobbyists for the church would come up with. And it says nothing about the actual confidentiality. We talked about the elders and their wives being a sieve for the congregation of information. And again, we were at one meeting where someone was disfellowshipped. It wasn't 5 minutes after the meeting, and the elder's wife says, "Oh yes, it's too bad. He just couldn't get a handle on his drinking." We knew why the individual was disfellowshipped, and we were just visitors within a few minutes of the end of the meeting.
Confidentiality.
The confidentiality is a joke, so it says nothing about actual confidentiality. It says under supposed church doctrine. So in other words, what we say it's supposed to be. But going back to that legal issue and taking it to a higher court, that's no doubt what they'll focus on. This isn't a situation where the perpetrator comes forward and confesses. This is the victim coming forward, which no doubt does not fall under penitent privilege. But again, it's got to have traction behind it. There has to be enough of an uprising, enough letters, enough signatures, enough. But the problem is that you've got to be unified underneath something. That's where organizations come in. The org. That's the power of the Borg. So now I guess if you want to get into some personal rants.
I'll just say I am really angry about this, and I tend to just be quiet, and that's why I really haven't said much, and just let Chad go, and just let Chad run with whatever he needs to say.
And that was just something that I wanted to tackle, again, nuts and bolts.
Yeah. And I haven't seen a lot. I mean, this is just fresh news. But at the same time, I'm really angry. I'm really ticked off about it. Maybe personally I'm invested in it in a few ways, but at the same time, I'm kind of mad because it's like, does this give Watchtower, like the right, in their own head, they have the right to like brag and boast about things. And they have before for a legal victory, for, freedom of religion or whatever legal victory they want to claim. It's like, are they going to publicly write in literature, "We won a case on child sex abuse. Jehovah was with us"? I mean, you know how dumb that sounds? You're going to be proud about that?
Jehovah was with us and hiding sex abuse.
It's maddening. It's really maddening. And, I try to think of that scripture in Luke. I think it's in Luke 18. And I'll maybe add it and post just the where it is on the screen. But it's about that woman who went to the judge, and the judge could not care for God. But the woman in the verse said, "I want justice." And the judge said, "Well, because this woman keeps making me trouble," and just that point of making me trouble, there needs to be more trouble. There needs to be more
traction.
Yeah, really. People need to be unified. Who cares what your story is? And I shouldn't say that. I'm not trying to seem insensitive. But it's like I've said before, the one thing that the XJW community has in common is that they're against Jehovah's Witnesses.
And that's it.
Because of their abuse, not just child sex abuse, but because of all the abuses, all the injustices, all the things that Watchtower does wrong. We need to come together. This is important. Protecting children is important. protecting your rights is important as a person. You know, I'm not a parent, but I can't imagine or being in a situation as a parent and having that scenario in my life. I can't even imagine. So I just feel like we just need to come together and be unified and just be unified against this, because this is wrong and the laws need to change. So I don't really know what else to say about it, other than just going on a longer tangent. It's just, we just need to come together as a community. Are you just thinking?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think about what you're saying versus the reality too. Because what are you going to do? Have an XJW everything goes movement?
Then you'll never win.
What do you mean?
I mean, people of the world are disunified, but there still is enough push to change legislation with whatever certain cause they have. But they're not unified. I mean, they're not going out and doing something in a unified way. I'm saying in their personal lives, you know, but they come together and they do what they have to do in order to change things.
And so what I'm saying is, are you not listening to what I just said?
Well, you're just talking about lobbyists.
And that's what works.
Yeah.
Lobbyists works. Coming together as a group does not work. It does not work. Grassroots movements do not work. They never have.
So then
they're grassroots movements. Yeah. They cause a bunch of noise off the front porch, but they don't do anything. Grassroots movements do not do anything. So then what do you need to do?
You need to write a letter to the Supreme Court? You need to write, we all need to write letters and protest like we did in Russia?
Because that's grassroots. Grassroots does not work. Did all those letters going to Russia make a dang bit of difference for witnesses?
No.
It doesn't do anything. Grassroots do not do anything.
So then you tell me what we're supposed to do.
I just told you, and you're not listening.
Lobbyists.
A lobbyist is sent forth from a group. A company will have lobbyists. Mm-hmm. Watchtower has lobbyists. So all of these, you have to have an entity behind the lobbyist. And the lobbyist is the one who goes forward at the tip of the spear. And he goes forward and he deals with it. It's the same thing as why can't I think of it? Unions. Mm-hmm. The workers' unions, and they send the one guy to represent the union. Mm-hmm. They don't all get together and decide, you know what, let's all write letters to the company. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So they unify in a union, and then they send the tip of the spear out. And he focuses on the point that they want to get done and comes to a certain conclusion to get what he needs done. That's how all those little bullet points get set up underneath that law, which invalidate the law pretty much. It's through a lobbyist. That's what works. Watchtower knows it works. They don't sit there and say, you know what, everybody needs to write the Supreme Court so that way we can toss this out. They don't do that way. They say, we've got 8 million members.
Yeah.
We represent a large amount of your populace, and we are going to state thus and so.
And that's an interesting perspective, because those 8 million so-called members are not just of Montana, not just of the United States, not just, they're an international organization.
Yep.
So that's what's frustrating. But yet they're still, I mean, how many XJWs, or even not XJWs, how many people are just against child abuse, period, no matter what circumstance there are?
Yep. And that's why Jonas sort of has the right idea. All religions must. Mm-hmm. And then, the traction behind that one singular idea. It's like you said, you know what, my Jesus is better than your Jesus and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
if you want to have that protest, go ahead and have your own protest with it. That's not what this is about.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about is doctrines aside, it doesn't mean anything.
Well, I don't say it doesn't mean anything, and I think you belittle the whole idea of religion in general by saying those types of statements.
No, I don't think it means anything when we come to the topic of child sex abuse.
Well, then qualify it.
And like I said, I feel frustrated because I am emotionally invested in this. Well, it's kind of like you said, we're victims of child abuse, but we're also victims of Watchtower as adults. So it's like you feel like you could just never get away from it. It's like your fate, and I don't mean that in that kind of terminology, but your fate is just to be tangled with abusive people for your whole life.
Yeah. Well, but that's what the scripture says. Men have dominated man to their injury.
And you know
what?
What different. A hopeless feeling, and there's no point to being here.
And that's what the kingdom's about. And that's what the entire kingdom's about, because you know what? You're not going to get justice in the system no matter how much you fight for it. Mm-hmm. And all you'll do is sit there and spin your wheels nonstop.
Yep, and that's why religion...
Watchtower's no different.
Yep, and that's why religion needs to be destroyed. And that's why, we could go on and on about, trust. Trust the elders, trust your parents. I mean, you can't even trust your parents.
Yeah.
You can't even trust your freaking parents.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because of what they do to their children.
Yeah, sometimes. And the scripture says that too.
But I mean, as a child, you're brought into this society of people, and your parents are supposed to be the ones to, take care of you and, all that. And it's simply not the truth. So it's like you're all the odds are against you, even coming into this society, coming into the world whatsoever.
In some cases, that's absolutely true. And we happen to have experienced that, to some degree, but not everybody does. So our perspective is from that avenue, and you have to understand that too. Not everyone comes from that lifestyle.
It's so difficult because it's like I think about it, and it's like there's no safe place. You can't put your kids in school because they may get shot. You can't trust the religious leaders of whatever religion you're a part of because they may sexually abuse your children. You can't trust your spouse because, maybe your spouse is going to rape your daughter or your son. You just can't trust absolutely anybody. There's no safe place for a child, and that's so wrong.
That's the world's injustice. But I mean, again, that's what the kingdom's about, isn't it? Isn't that what we were all drawn to as witnesses? The fact that those things will change under God's righteous rule, and mankind, no matter what laws you put on the books and what principles, you can't stop someone from doing those things. That's the bottom line.
And that's what's so disgusting, is that the kingdom that we were taught about, granted from the Bible it says that, but even through Watchtower, has made that kingdom seem really fairy tale.
Yeah, I don't think they've...
Because from their perspective, yeah. Oh, it's the kingdom, it's the kingdom. Meanwhile, I'm going to rape you.
Right.
How wrong is that?
Right. Yep.
The kingdom comes through us and I'm going to rape you?
Right. But that's exactly what Jesus said to the religious leaders in his day, right?
It's just so frustrating.
You shut up the kingdom into 4 people and you yourselves don't even go in.
It's just such a hopeless situation. I just can't even... And it's like I said yesterday, I really feel bad for the victims, Lexi or whoever else is going through a child sex abuse case with Watchtower or any other entity, but specifically Watchtower. It's like you believe that you're going to get justice through the organization because that's what you're told. No, they don't give you justice. So then you're told you have a right to go to the authorities. So you go to the authorities to get justice. They don't give you justice. So it's like, what a hopeless feeling.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what Jeremiah spoke about. Here it is, the priest and the...
You just lose hope.
Let me finish?
Yeah.
The priest and the judge conspire together, and they work it out together.
Yep.
And that's what we see in all of these statutes that basically invalidate the law that they even wrote. But again, not all states are the same in that regard, and so there's going to be a lot of these states where the traction
will pick up.
Pick up, and a lot of these, because of the traction, will change the policies or the laws. But that's what it takes. And you can have several different spears, you might say, but you also have to remember, if you take one nail and go like that with it, it'll go through your hand. If you take 100 nails and go like that with them, it does nothing to your hand. It just does nothing. So if you've got too many spears, all it does is just push it away as opposed to penetrate and be effective and make change. So it's like you've got to stab with one at a time or two or three at a time. You can't get everything done. And that's what's hard for the XJW community to realize, that, I'm sorry that you don't like the fact that you're being shunned, but I'm sorry you don't have any legal stance whatsoever when you slept with your girlfriend. I'm sorry you don't have any legal stance if you stole something and they disfellowshipped you. The legal pinpoints, and that's what we were talking about. We had that conversation with my sister, is that discussing all those different points, she goes, yeah, that sucks, but that one's not against the law, as far as I'm aware. And she was very humble in the fact of saying, that's not my specialty, but is that in the law? Is that against the law? And the reality is a lot of those things aren't against the law. So you have to make sure that it's against the law. Is it slander? Is it a moral turpitude? So it's kind of funny is that is the law isn't about morality, and yet moral turpitude is a law about morality. So it's kind of interesting how you frame it legally in your pinpoint is what matters. And that's the difficult part about right and wrong versus legality, or justice versus legality. I know that the whole idea is Lady Justice, and I mean, I get it. Lady Justice is holding one of these. But the reality is, it's not about justice. It's about legality. And Lady Justice isn't the justice system. It's the whole system. You have legislation, you have the judicial branch, you have all of these different branches that work together to try to accomplish some semblance of justice, which there are so many cracks in that inevitably individuals follow through, especially when the cracks are put there purposefully by lobbyists.
It's just a broken system.
Absolutely.
It's just a broken system.
Absolutely. And that's what Jesus talked about. A monarchy with justice. He will not judge by what's, visible to the eyes. He'll look at the situation as a whole, the individual's motives, the spirit behind the law, as opposed to just legality. And that's what he hated about the Pharisaic system, and how they were lawyers. That's all it was to it.
And that's one of the things that I was going to say is that, we're told from the scriptures, being no part of the world, and then Watchtower takes it, no voting. I'm not going to even get into a debate about politics, but it's obvious that Watchtower is very political. Political with a small p.
Yeah.
And political with a big P. We
had a Bible study that ran the presidential campaign in 1972
or something like that. Yeah, early 70s.
Anyway, and he said, if you're fighting against it, you're in it. You're involved in it. So he acknowledged that. He pretty much lives as a hermit now. But his statements of there's politics with the big P, and then there's small p politics, which is just dealing with people.
Yeah.
And they are totally have the small p politics going on
amongst the congregation, and dealing with one another.
And the little p even goes and affects the big P, which is the politics of this system of things, or this governments. But
that's what's so frustrating, because it's like they're so quick to. They're just greedy. I don't know what it is. They're just so greedy.
It's not just greedy. There's.
Well, I'm not even saying greedy as far as money. Yeah, obviously that's the case. But it's like greedy for their own authority, greedy for their own money, greedy for their own brand, greedy for, I mean, there's so many things you could be greedy for, not
Sure.
not just money.
Right.
And to be greedy over protecting what they claim, Jesus' precious sheep. I mean, come on. They don't care about you. They care about themselves.
Yeah. The brand, the entity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, quite honestly, that's no different than any government.
Mm-hmm.
It goes into this country all the time. Oh, we're the most free country. Yet you'll see somebody that's in some European country going, how do you figure? How do you figure that you're the most free? Granted, we're freer than some countries are, but that's a pretty low bar to set in some cases. I mean,
it's just like Mark O'Donnell said, I think, on his Facebook post that said, I think he said something like, this just proves we're a long way from, maybe I should just read it. But I know it was on his Facebook page.
basically got a lot of work to do yet.
Well, I guess you can close with it then.
No, go ahead.
I don't know what else to say. I don't know what else to say other than I just feel really sorry for those victims. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's easy to say, well, that's not fair. Yeah, nothing in life is fair. And it's like, well, then why do we even have things set in motion? Why do we have things in place like this?
And that's what's separating emotion from the facts is.
Yeah.
And the problem is that you have to get all those motions aligned, separate out what isn't going to be focused on the point to achieve a goal. It's not that they're invalid, it's just that they don't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to get the traction behind a certain point is, or does, is effective. It accomplishes something. Anyway, let us know your thoughts below.